His deficit reduction efforts were recognized by such organizations as the Business Roundtable, Citizens for a Sound Economy, the National Taxpayers Union, and Citizens Against Government Waste. Penning has co-authored 3 books: Common Sense, the 15 Biggest Lies in Politics, and Payment Due. Born and raised in southeastern Minnesota, Penning has 4 adult children and resides in Waseca. Please join me in welcoming our presenters. We will begin with Mr. Horner to give us some background on the issue and the Impartial Justice Act.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for coming out. I know that the weather forecast was a little precarious, and it seems as if, at least for now, we've dodged the sleet or snow or rain or whatever was forecast. So I always feel compelled after that introduction to acknowledge that if nothing else in my gubernatorial campaign, I proved once and for all that nobody pays attention to editorial writers anymore. Sorry, Joe. Which is why we're doing these forums about this proposed constitutional amendment that is incredibly important to Minnesota. You know, one of the things that I've always treasured as a native Minnesotan is this reputation, well-earned, that we have for good government. And it's really a reputation for good government at every level. At the local level, in our school boards, our city councils, our county commissions, in the state legislature, although that sometimes has been challenged in recent years, in the executive branch, but in particular in the judicial branch. Minnesota is recognized throughout the country as having one of the strongest judicial branches, one of the strongest systems of courts in the country. And you ask yourself, well, why is that? What makes it so special in Minnesota? Well, there are a couple of things. One is that we have a system of courts in Minnesota that attracts some really first-rate people. And part of that is that we over the years, for the highest courts, have created a merit selection panel that has recruited and brought forth for gubernatorial appointment some really high quality, outstanding people who have been willing to give their time, their talents, and even their resources, because it still is the case that you can make a lot more money in private law practice than you can on the bench, to serve on the court. And we've kept our courts above partisan politics. We haven't had the kinds of elections that we're starting to see in some other states that I think Tim is going to talk a little bit about, that really have been destructive to the impartiality of courts. It's fine, and maybe even in some ways good, when we have the kinds of partisan battles in our legislative branches that we've seen in Minnesota over the last couple of years, that we saw over the last several weeks in Washington. It's good when we have strong partisan interests that represent different perspectives. But when we stand before a judge, we don't want to stand before that judge as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, a Green Party, or whatever, and know that that judge was elected as somebody from another party. We want to stand before that judge and be evaluated on the basis of the law. We don't want to have justices, I think, and I think this is a commonly held sentiment, we don't want to have justices that were elected on the basis of declaring that whenever somebody comes before me who did this or that, I'm going to find that person guilty, or I'm going to declare that illegal, or I'm going to rule that that's unconstitutional, and make that judgment before the facts are presented, before all of the issues are evaluated, and we've had the kinds of conversations that occur in courts. We want to continue with truly impartial courts. And so over the last couple of years, what we've seen are some decisions nationally and in Minnesota that have threatened the future impartiality of the courts. We've ruled in Minnesota, for example, that candidates for the bench are able to go out and raise money without limit. that they're able to engage in partisan activities. They're able to run as a partisan. And all of that opens the door to what we've seen in some other states that I think is very dangerous. And so a commission headed by former Governor Al Quie, former member of Congress, one of the most respected elder statesmen, I believe, in Minnesota, came together, brought together some thoughtful people to say, how do we protect the impartiality of our courts? How do we protect the quality of our courts? And came up with a three-legged stool that addresses each of the issues that I think people have. The first leg of the stool is to take the merit selection process that we have and apply it to every level of the courts. So candidates for courts are screened by qualified people, they're recruited by qualified people, they come to the governor for appointment having gone through this vetting process so that the best and the brightest surface. And now, instead of just applying it to the appellate courts, the proposal is to apply it to every court, so that candidates for the judicial branch have to come through the screening process before they're appointed by the governor. But secondly, we as the public ought to have some good, unvarnished information about how well they're performing on the bench once they get on the bench. And so the second leg of the stool is to create knowledge and share it, to create an evaluation process. Again, through unbiased, impartial people, experts, a diverse range of opinions, and it's really a two-step process. One part of the evaluation is private. It's for the justice, him or herself, to say, here's how you're performing, here's how you can do better. Because at the end of the day, what we really want are better justices, better judges. And so part of it is improvement. Here's how you can become a better judge. The second part, though, is public information. Here's how we who deal with this court believe this judge operates. Here's the qualifications, here are the skills, here's whether we think this is a good justice who upholds the tradition of Minnesota qualities. And that information is made public. And thirdly, ultimately, the public still holds the final say in whether or not a person continues on the bench. Because the third leg of the stool is to hold what are held retention elections. Wouldn't it be unique to Minnesota? Some 20 states already hold these retention elections. And unlike today's elections, where you go into that voting booth and you go down the list and you vote for governor and senator and member of Congress and legislator and county commissioner, and then you flip it over and you see this whole list of justices, 90% of whom are unopposed, and you say, I don't know, and you walk away from it. And a lot of ballots are left blank. Now you have one simple question. You have the information from this impartial evaluation committee, and the only question applying to that judge on the ballot says, should we retain this justice or shouldn't we? Not running against an opponent, running against the standards that we as Minnesotans think are important for people who are serving on our bench. And if that person is rejected, then it's back to the beginning of the process, another candidate from the merit selection process who is evaluated, who also then will stand for a retention election. So it covers the concerns that people have had. It recruits the best candidates, brings forward the best people. It gives we, the public, information about how these justices are serving, but it also gives the justice information about how to be a better judge. And thirdly, it ultimately retains the power in the people to say, we ought to continue with this judge, or we ought to move on. That's what's going to retain the quality and the impartiality of Minnesota's courts.
Thank you, Tom, for that background. Now I'll turn to Tim and have him discuss a little bit about why we need these reforms.
Well, I think the best place to start is with our current political process. our current political culture, I think you'd be hard pressed to find very many voters that believe that in the partisan election world we've had positive experiences in recent years. Campaigns in recent decades have become far more negative in nature, and they have involved higher and higher sums of dollars, most of which have been focused on 30-second messages, most of which tend not to be the most objective or even the most factual. That is the environment in our partisan political environment when we elect people to the state legislature or to Congress or to the governorship or even the presidency. And I think given our growing distaste for that kind of political culture, it's a hard argument to make that it is the kind of model we want to follow for the selection of judges. Having said that, it's been compounded in recent years with a couple court rulings that now have authorized a whole new flood of dollars to come into our political system. The Citizens United ruling essentially takes the lid off of campaign funding, not the candidates who at both the state and federal level face some restrictions or limitations on how much they can raise from any individual or group. But these independent, so-called independent expenditures can come in well, they come in to the political process in ways that, at least at the federal level, are both unlimited and unaccountable, because you really don't have any process to track these dollars in the same way that you track campaign contributions to an individual candidate. And here at the state level, these independent expenditures are reported, so we've at least brought it into the light of day. But the amounts of these dollars often dwarf the amount that candidates are raising and spending on their own behalf. I just happened to have lunch today with a candidate for the Minnesota State Legislature who lost their re-election bid. But what I didn't know until this conversation is that, well, his own campaign fundraising was capped both in the amount he could raise from any individual or individual source. But his overall limit was like $68,000, and yet he had outside expenditures from a particular source coming in the range of $30,000, half as much as he spent. It was an outside group that he didn't even want to come in. They were trying to come in supposedly on his behalf, but they were independent, so they came in despite the fact that once he heard about it, once he saw what was happening, he asked them to desist. And he believes it had an impact on his election, not one he would have wanted, because the money they spent was spent in a way that violated his own sense of integrity in the kind of attack that they were leveling. On the flip side, his opponent was also capped at $68,000 or whatever the Minnesota allows for this. Minnesota would allow for a state senate campaign. But the outside expenditures on behalf of his opponent were in the range of $130,000 to $140,000, roughly twice what the candidate himself could raise and spend. It's this floodgate of additional dollars coming in, much of what is not accountable in the same way that the money coming to a candidate would be accountable. So I think that's the context in which we're in, and while there may be some who would assert there are benefits to all of this, I think most of us feel that we've been sort of dirtied by the process. And I think it is a hard case to make that somehow extending this process to judicial elections, where we want people on the bench who are objective and fair and will make rulings according to the law and will not be swayed by political pressure, political contributions, or other factors, are presiding. Why this is important and why this sets the context for action at this time is a 2005 court ruling that essentially opens the door for political endorsements and unlimited campaign fundraising on the behalf of judicial candidates. And so we are at risk that this kind of partisan campaign activity is going to soon be the norm in our state. It's beginning to encroach in other states. When I went to Congress, oh my God, 30 years ago, it's hard to admit it's been that long, but when I went there, I was really alarmed to meet colleagues from other states, and they would talk about judicial elections in terms of democratically endorsed judges and Republican endorsed judges, and I thought, this really happens? This really happens, that you have people elected on a partisan basis? I would never want to be in front of a judge who was elected because they towed the party line for either of the major parties. That's not the kind of mindset I want to face when I step into a courtroom. And yet that has been the case in states across the country. I don't think we want to go there in Minnesota. Let me give you just a couple examples of how money and outside interests have in recent years begun to encroach on judicial elections. One that I will cite is a West Virginia case of several years ago, a state that evidently does elect judges on a partisan ballot. There was a Democratic judge who ruled against a mining company. Damages to that company were like $50 million. The company, or the owner of the company, expended about $3 million to defeat the incumbent judge, succeeded in doing so. The new judge, on appeal, overturned the $50 million in damages. So $3 million expended in order to get $50 million back. Yeah, it's a pretty good return on investment. On the flip side, in our neighboring state of Wisconsin, because many people were unhappy with some of the actions of the Wisconsin legislature to modify and restrict the union bargaining rights, there was a huge campaign to unseat a Supreme Court judge in Wisconsin in order to get a judge more favorable to Democratic or union perspectives on that issue. $4.5 million flooded into Wisconsin in order to defeat that incumbent judge, and he barely survived the effort. This is the kind of thing that we're seeing increasingly across the country, and I don't think we want to see it here in Minnesota. I'm really proud to be among others who have endorsed this effort. You'll see in the literature, if you go to the website, a long list of individuals, former elected officials, former judges, others that are supportive of this reform. You'll also see a long list, a surprising list of organizations that support this effort, ranging from the Chamber of Commerce to the AFL-CIO, ranging from groups like Common Cause, good government groups like Common Cause, to other groups that you wouldn't necessarily even identify as groups that are focused on this kind of an issue, but they see the importance of having impartiality as best we can get it in our courtrooms, because any of us at any time, for a variety of reasons, could be there, and we all want a fair process. So Governor Quee, 30-some years ago, began this merit selection process. And while it was not legislated until the late 1990s, both on an informal basis and then since the late 1990s on a more formal basis, this merit selection process has been the way that we have made judicial appointments in our state. The commission that makes these recommendations is comprised of people appointed by the governor, people appointed by the Supreme Court of Minnesota, as well as citizens from each of the judicial regions within the state. And over time, I think they've made good appointments, and in recent years, governors have expanded it beyond the district courts to cover some of their appellate court and even Supreme Court nominees. I think it has worked well, and I credit Quee. I was at his 90th birthday party a few weeks ago, and I remember him saying, among his words of advice to anybody who cared to listen, as a sage old statesman, he said, there's one thing you need to learn in politics, and that's patient persistence. So he's been a very patient man in advocating for impartial courts all these years, and I think the commission that has come forward with these recommendations is an outgrowth of his wisdom and his patience. As Tom mentioned a moment ago, we do have 20 states that use a retention process, and Tom described how that would work. But 2/3 of our states do have some kind of a merit-based process for the selection of judges. So it's not as if this is a new idea. I think in some ways we've learned from the experience in other states and crafted an approach here in Minnesota that will be even better than the other states. There's no denying, in my view, that it's going to be day and night in terms of what we could face if this kind of highly partisan and highly expensive campaigning starts to come to our judicial races in Minnesota. But it won't be perfect. In Iowa, where they do have a retention process, a lot of money did come in and defeated a few people who had made a decision that voters in the state evidently weren't appreciative. It had to do with a social issue. But even though the money still came in and on a retention basis some judges were dumped, the new judges were appointed through a merit process. And so even though you can't stop necessarily all the money from coming in and having some sort of an influence, you still have the backstop or the backdrop of a retention process that assures that even if that were to happen, we still have a more objective process from which to select new replacement judges. And then those judges, as Tom described in his discussion of how this would work, those judges would stand for election on a retention basis in the not too distant future. And between that time, they would be judged by this quality board and have a chance to improve if there are deficiencies. And if they don't, then of course that quality rating would be public knowledge, and the voters would have that information upon which to cast their retention vote. So I think there is a context of why this is becoming more urgent. And as we look at the 2014 legislative session, it won't be as busy as last year. It's not a budget year. They've got less to do up there. So it might be a good year for them to look at our political process, and especially as it applies to our judicial elections, and give us the opportunity as Minnesotans to reform our process in a way that assures that going forward we will continue to be highly regarded across the nation as a state with a good merit-based process, and a state that has courts that are above review.
And just to add a quick postscript to Tim's last comment, Governor Dayton specifically has called for the 2014 session to be what he labels the unsession, where we're going to look at reforms, and specifically in how government functions and operates. This would require a change in the Constitution. So the legislature will have to approve a constitutional amendment, put it on the ballot in 2014, and let you, the people, decide whether or not we want to change the process. But this is exactly the kind of reform issue that should be part of the unsession, where we talk about the kind of government that we want for Minnesota.
Thanks, Tim and Tom. I think the volunteers are possibly passing around cards you could write questions on. If you have some, and maybe bring them up here when we're done. I can jump in with a couple of questions just to kind of get the conversation started. And maybe, Tom, to you with the background, how would the average voter notice the difference in how they vote for a judge with the new system versus the old?
Yeah,
how would they notice it?
Yeah, great question. And let me take two approaches. So I think the voter, comparing it to the current system, would have a couple of things. First of all, much more information and much more qualified information. This evaluation panel is going to provide information that's going to be widely disseminated. People will have the appraisal of experts, people who deal with the judge, with the courtroom, in saying, is this judge a good judge? And that person will be evaluated, and people will have the information. And then secondly, a person doesn't have to decide, do I want candidate X versus candidate Y? The decision is simply based on this information, this unbiased information. Should we keep this person on the bench? And it's a straight up or down vote. So better information, a simpler decision, Because what happens now is something like 90% of judges run unopposed. There's no information, there's no alternative, and so they simply continue on. But I think what's also important to keep in mind, as Tim was outlining, think of where we might be headed with the judges. And now you look to the future, and this is going to be a selection, an election based on information, based on quality, based on who's going to be a good judge. What we may have in the future is going to be an election based on who raises the most money, who has the most friends, who's willing to make the most extreme decisions, the most partisan decisions. That's the prospect for the future that we ought to work hard to avoid.
Thanks, Tom. The second step of that, okay, if I vote in the retention election, I vote the guy down, or the judge down, what's
Right.
the next step there?
Then the person is out of office, and now we go back to the merit selection panel, and there's an appointment of a new judge based on this rigorous screening process, based on the experts, bipartisan, multi-partisan, representing all of the disciplines that make up our courts, to come to the governor to say, here's our slate of candidates, here are the people who qualify to be on the bench.
And the governor would appoint again,
Correct.
just as he does now?
Right.
Okay.
And in the middle of that term, there would be this review.
Right.
Which would be made available to the judge, so that if they're being viewed as deficient in some respect, they've got an opportunity to evaluate that. And at the end of their term, when they're on the ballot, prior to that retention election, there will be this public release of their evaluation. And so now, in the 90% of races where we have no competition, there's really next to no public information about these judges or anything about their performance on the bench. And so you go in and you vote, and typically we'll vote to approve them because they're unopposed. But I would venture to say that the vast majority of voters cast a ballot for names they've never heard of, or at least aren't familiar with. I know that's even true for me, and I suspect I follow politics and judicial matters more closely than others, given my political inclinations. And so, in some respects, it becomes a meaningless exercise. Cast a ballot upon which there's really little that you know and little way to find anything out unless you're very aggressive in evaluating newspaper clippings about judicial decisions over the last few years. I would much rather, and I would think most voters would much rather have a process where if most of them are unopposed anyway, we at least know, have reason to know, and have an opportunity to know at least something about them to determine whether they do merit continuation on the court. In the case of campaigns where there is a challenger and where there are debates, then at least we know something. We may not know anything that's entirely useful, but however we decide to vote in those contested judicial elections, we also have the benefit of knowing that whether we retain the judge or whether we reject the judge, there will be this, and what I'm saying is there can still be groups that come in. It won't be like we're voting for an opponent. We're voting against the judge based on some campaign that's been waged against them. We will know that there's this retention process that will then apply to whoever gets appointed to fill that vacancy. And so going forward, we get back into that same cycle of at least knowing something about the judge prior to election day. And again, right now, we only have about 10% of judges that are opposed. Going forward, maybe we'll only have about 10% for which there's some sort of an assertive campaign against them for some reason. But the backdrop, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, then is that we go back to the merit selection process, and that new judge will then be subject to the same retention process.
And to contrast that with what could be coming, going back to the West Virginia case Tim mentioned, so this justice to the Supreme Court was elected as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was the deciding vote in a 3-2 decision, and he's on that bench for 12 years with almost no way to get him off. That's the prospect that we face in Minnesota.
Okay. A lot of the questions coming in sort of touch on what you were talking about, Tim. The criteria by which the judges are judged. There's an evaluation by a panel. Who's on the panel?
I've got that here.
Okay. And how do they get there?
The panel is going to be comprised of people appointed by the governor, people appointed by the legislature, and people appointed by the Supreme Court. And it must include people, it must include a minority in total that are not attorneys.
Right, although they will set up a minority who are not attorneys. They will set up objective criteria, but then there's also an interviewing process. So these members of the evaluation panel are actually going to talk to the people who try cases, who represent people within this court before this judge. Does the judge understand the rules of procedure? Does the judge follow them? Are the rulings clear? Is there some common sense? And so it's not just 5 people sitting around saying, we like this guy, we don't like this guy, he wears really nice ties, he doesn't. It's going against objective criteria and talking to the people who actually practiced before the judge. And importantly, the first part of the process is private. It's the evaluation panel going to Joe to say, Joe, here are 10 things you can do to be a better judge. And this is between you and me. The second part of it is public. That's the
That's
key.
the part that occurs
There's the
during
improvement
the election
process.
year.
That's right. The improvement process, because we don't want to wait for an election to get a better judge. We want that judge to be improving all the while. And then secondly, the public disclosure of here's what we think works, here's what doesn't work.
And the factors that have been spelled out against which this commission will rate incumbent judges is knowledge of the law, procedure, integrity, impartiality, temperament, respect for the litigants, respect for the rule of law, administrative skill, punctuality, communication skill. And they are not to judge on the specific issues,
Right, on the rulings.
but on the process.
To stop
that
you
they
there,
used.
isn't that what most people would want to know about, though? The content of the rulings? And why would they not include something about that? Or does that fit in one of those categories?
Well, if the rulings somehow run afoul of the law in some way, where they're sort of bending the interpretation of the law in a certain way, that would be taken into account. And in addition, I would think that that would apply to temperament and whether the rulings are fair, whether they seem, whether the ruling or the judgment seems to comport with the severity of the issue before the court.
And Joe, I think you're right. I mean, look at, this is not a panacea that's going to remove, you know, all conversations out of the process. So yes, I mean, there still will be some people who want to know if that judge ruled in a way that agrees with me or I disagree with.
Yeah.
That was the case
But
in Iowa.
But I don't think you want that to be the purpose of this
Right,
commission.
right. And what we have right now, what we saw in Iowa was a lot of money going in simply to say, this judge ruled against values of Iowa, ruled in favor of same-sex marriage. That shouldn't be the sole criterion. It should be, here's the thoughtfulness that he brought to the process. Here's the protocol that he followed. Here's the reason why. Now here's objective information. You can still decide to throw this judge out just because you don't like the ruling, and that's going to still happen. But at least now we have some balance to say, but look at all of the things that this judge is deemed to do very well by an objective panel.
You know, it looks like there's a lot of diverse groups supporting this proposal, labor and business, and why do you think it, maybe to both of you, why hasn't it passed yet or been approved? Or maybe that's a political question for you first, Jim.
Yeah, well, a part of it is that, at least at this point, it has not garnered enough legislative interest, and it starts with the chairman of the committee, who still is, I think, open-minded, but has questions about whether this process would be better than the current process. I think there's some complacency that we haven't had problems. It's sort of like warning about things that could happen when it hasn't yet happened in Minnesota. So I think, truthfully, we've got our work cut out for us as part of this coalition for impartial justice to make the case that this really is an issue where we can get ahead of the curve, and that this is our best suggestion as a way to keep our judicial system as impartial as possible. So I think there's a lack of urgency. I really believe that the more legislators focus on this issue, the more they'll see the need for reform before we experience some of the problems that have cropped up in other states. We aren't there yet, and that's why we have this coalition, and that's why we were eager to sign on to this coalition, as many dignitaries as we could, and as many organizations as we could, because these organizations collectively represent a really broad cross-section of Minnesotans, and the more of them that communicate to their legislators about the need for these reforms, the more likely it is that it will be taken up this session.
And I mean, some of it, frankly, is a philosophical difference. And there are people who believe that the public is well served by having judicial campaigns in which candidates say, if this issue comes before me, I'm going to rule this way, or I'm going to rule that way. Tim and I disagree with that approach. We think it's better to have courts served by judges who are impartial, who listen to the facts around a specific case without getting locked into a hypothetical. But there are those who believe that a robust debate, a robust campaign that allows people to say, I mean, it's kind of this notion of activist courts. It's an activist court when it makes a ruling that I disagree with. It's a great court when it rules in my favor. There are people who want to know, they want to stack the deck. Before I elect this judge, how is this judge going to rule on issues that I care about? I think we ought to have good people serving on the bench and then trust them to make the right decisions based on the law, based on the evidence, based on the facts.
Another question that's coming up frequently in the cards is, this looks like it takes the power away from people and gives it to lawyers. People can vote on their judges, and if there are opposing judges right now, they can vote for both of them, or either one of them. Now all of a sudden we're creating a panel. I think the concern is that it's lawyers, and we know that they can be friends of judges a lot and work with judges a lot. Is this taking power away from people, or?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it gives people much more power because it gives them knowledge, it gives them real information. Look, I think that those people who oppose this and those who support it do agree that 90% of judges running unopposed with under the radar screen kinds of elections is not the best process. We've ended up in Minnesota with a very good bench, not necessarily because of the electoral process. And I think both sides would agree with that. One side would say the information we ought to have ought to come through those people who can fund the kinds of political campaigns that we see for other offices, that we see for the legislature, for local offices, for governor, for Senate, for members of Congress. We ought to have that kind of race. There are others who say, no, we ought to have the kind of information that comes from people, some of whom are attorneys, many of whom aren't, that looks at what's the job description of a judge? And how is this judge performing against that job description? And then provide that information to the public, not to say, is Joe Doe better than Jane Smith, but to say, here's Joe Doe, a judge for 2 years in Blue Earth District Court. Joe Doe has done this well, this not so well, this really not so well. Do you want to keep him on the bench or not? That's information you can act on. That's information that leads to a good court, not just to a single judge who on a single issue might vote in my favor.
Another issue that comes up is the panel. How do we know they are impartial? And can there be, maybe connected to that, can there be an average citizen on that panel?
No, I'm not sure if it.
Well, and the governor, well, let's see. I'm looking at the evaluation panel, the merit selection panel.
The results of the work of the panel are is all public. That's how we know, we can make the decision, have they done a good job or not. I believe, but we'll have to confirm this, that citizens can be appointed, right, through the legislative process, through the gubernatorial process. So yeah, I mean, anybody in this room could say, look, I really care about this. I'm going to invest the time. I'm going to learn about the protocols, about the law, about what a judge should do, and I want to sit on that panel and make evaluations of judges that I'll share with my fellow citizens.
Yeah, the merit selection panel will be constituted very much the way it is today.
Right.
There will be members appointed by the governor and some appointed by the court, and some will have to be citizens drawn from the different judicial districts in the state. And I think altogether there are 49 people on this panel, but 13 are impaneled at any given time, depending upon which judicial district they're reviewing the appointment for. What's being proposed in terms of the commission that would evaluate judge performance, that would be 8 gubernatorial appointees, no more than 3 can be attorneys, 8 Supreme Court appointees, no more than 4 can be attorneys, and the legislative minority and majority parties will be allowed 8 members, and no more than 4 of those can be attorneys. So
you're
majority
guaranteed
would not be attorneys, and in each of those processes, you would hope that your elected people, this gets to the point of where does your voice come in, since instead of voting one candidate against another in a judicial race, you're really voting to retain or not to retain a judge. Your voice sort of comes in through the elections you have for governor and for the legislature, who in turn will make appointments to these
Bipartisan appointments because of the process.
because of the process.
Right.
A couple of quick questions here. Are there any groups that we know of opposed to these changes?
I don't know of organized groups. There are some ad hoc organized groups. Again, I mean, the opposition tends to come from political interests. The most prominent people tend to have been conservative Republicans who believe that a robust debate funded by political contributors is going to lead to a better bench than what we have now, or than this alternative process.
It's surprising, on the list of those that support it would be the Center of the American Experiment, which is undeniably a conservative think tank. They were formed 30 years ago or 20 years ago to be a conservative think tank here in Minnesota. But on the flip side, you've got Growth and Justice, which was formed maybe 10 years ago to be a liberal think tank and advocacy group in our state. You've got the Citizens League, which has almost a 50-year history. Tom, you were the chairman of that board for a while, back to the 1950s, I believe. but pride
Not
themselves.
my chairmanship.
No,
Yeah,
but the organization.
itself, right.
And they pride themselves on being a nonpartisan
Right.
organization. The League of Women Voters as well, which has a long history of advocacy for good government, clean government, a nonpartisan organization. But then you have groups like the Insurance Federation of Minnesota and the Council of Nonprofits, a business group and a nonprofit group. You've also got the Minnesota Chamber, as well as many regional chambers and city chambers, as well as the AFL-CIO, and they're certainly not on the same side of issues. But I think the point I'm trying to make by giving you that juxtaposition is that you've got organizations on both sides of the political aisle who have come together in support of this approach, because all of them want the same thing when it comes to a court. They want a court that's impartial, fair, making rulings based on the law, and not a court that is influenced by politics or money or partisan agendas.
And I don't think anyone would suggest that Al Quie is too far to the left. You know, Al Quie continues to be one of, I think, the most thoughtful public policy people we have in the state, a man of tremendous integrity, but certainly while he was in office and as he celebrates into his 91st year now, certainly a true conservative.
This is an interesting question. What's to stop outside funds and influences from getting on the committee, getting their guy on the impartial committee?
You know, there's, for those people who are dedicated, absolutely.
This is not a panacea.
That's right, there's always a way.
I mentioned the experience in Iowa just to demonstrate that even
Right.
with a retention process, outside money can come in and defeat an incumbent. But at least in that case, the fallback goes to another merit-based selection, and then the next election leads to another retention vote. The same thing could be true here. You've got several appointments from the governor, several from the legislature. Could one party or the other make a very deliberate choice of someone on this commission because of a particular view on a particular issue or a particular fidelity to a political agenda? I suppose they could, but you can't protect against all eventualities. And we think this at least gives us a more accountable
And there's some sunshine
transparent
here.
process.
That's right. I mean, it's the transparency, and there's public information, and it's not a system that is totally captive to the big money special interests that we're seeing in some other states in judicial elections.
Another quick question, will a judge have tenure like a teacher in this new system, I'm assuming they're asking?
No, I mean, the judge will serve a term, yes, but then they are accountable to the retention election.
And they run in the election when their term is up.
Yeah, this doesn't change terms of office for district judges, appellate judges, or Supreme Court justices.
Right.
Those remain the same. It's just that when they come up at the end of their term, it'll be a retention process.
And the question is, why are judges not graded under the present system?
I think there are some groups that do it, but for example, somebody said, well, you know, we want a bunch of attorneys dominating this. Isn't that better than we voters making these decisions? I don't know what the question was exactly, but that was the implication. They get rated, you know, the trial attorneys do some ratings, I think, for their own purposes and for their own membership. The Bar Association does kind of who's qualified, who's not qualified. But, you know, this is setting up more of a process that hopefully is accountable to the general electorate. And that's why these different entities, the three branches of our government, have several appointments that they will make to this commission. I think this hopefully becomes a more trusted source, and they will be under some requirement to do their best to highly publicize their findings as they do these evaluations.
And I think that trust is key. Joe, you know, at the free press, you get a rating, a scorecard, or whatever from an interest group, and you say, well, interesting, but they represent this slice of the pie, and it's not particularly newsworthy. Now, the media are going to have information coming from an objective source based on uniform criteria, representing the broad interests of the people of Minnesota. That's a legitimate news story. There is a compelling interest in getting that information out to the public that I think with the quality of media that we have in the state, that we will see that publicized broadly, and voters will have the kind of information that today they don't have, and that under a partisan election process won't have either, because there they'll have information that comes only from those who have the most money.
Can judges campaign in retention elections?
Yes, you know, and I think what we are going to see, frankly, is even with this, the way the court rulings are going, you know, I mean, politics is going to come into every aspect of our government. That's unavoidable. Our effort here is let's make sure that we can do as much as we can to make it the practice in Minnesota that the campaigns only go to a certain point, that the campaigns are based on the objective information. So would we expect a judge to say, well, I got this bad rating because, or they overlooked this? Sure, and that's part of valid information. But they're not campaigning against Tim Penny, who's saying, oh, you know, this guy, I mean, it's that old joke about the Southern politician who accused his opponent of going up to one of those big fancy Eastern colleges where he matriculated, and then he became a practicing thespian. You know, we don't need those kinds of campaigns of innuendo, of attack. When you don't have an opponent, now you're campaigning against objective facts. That's a different kind of campaign.
Tim, you have looked at some of the history and how this happens in other states. In states with merit selection, retention elections, do we know what the percentage of judges are retained? Heard anything like that?
I don't think I have that.
Okay, we can, I think that's folks at Common
We
Cause
can
said they
maybe-
could look it up.
Maybe somebody can Google that. quick.
99%.
Is it 99%? Yeah.
Okay.
Must be
But-
really
but-
good judges.
Really good
Well, but
judges.
remember, they come through a merit selection process. So, yeah, I mean, is 99% high? Probably too high. But they start at a higher level because they are coming through a merit selection process.
You know, I think this question sort of gets at the case you mentioned earlier, Tim, about the West Virginia. Is it possible that, you know, the money flowed into that case and the real reason was to influence the judge to be a better judge and to use the rule of law instead of politics? I mean, we assume that it's just, you know, the Democratic judge was right and the Republican judge was wrong, bought off.
Yeah, I'd rather rest on the principle here. Do we want an election in which your interest was not decided by that judge, and therefore I'm putting this candidate up and I'm getting rid of that judge because this candidate will reverse the decision, will rule in my favor. I don't like that any better in West Virginia, where it had to do with a fine against a mining company, than I do in Wisconsin, where the liberal side was trying to get rid of an incumbent judge because they felt that judge upheld a law that they didn't like. So I'd rather keep it on the level of the principle. Yes, the short answer to your question is yes, but the longer answer is even if that West Virginia judge that got defeated wrongly decided that case, I don't think this is the best way for us to reconcile that transgression.
Are there any current legislators we know of supporting this? Names, please.
I don't know. Do you have a list of the sponsors?
Probably the only.
Yeah.
A question related to that, I understand the Judges Association in Minnesota is neutral on this. Is that correct? Is what I've heard?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Any insight into that?
No, I don't.
I don't want to speculate. I mean,
Right.
there are lots
Right.
of reasons they could, and one may simply be that it could appear self-serving to, weigh in on this issue. That would be a guess.
Okay.
And the cynical
And can you-
guess would be, if I keep my job 9 times out of 10 without any opposition,
Right.
let's not
What's the
delay.
big guess would mean for reform?
Yeah.
It's working pretty well right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder if either of you have an opinion about, as we often notice on a local level, a judge will really not be challenged by a local attorney because they feel like if they lose,
Right.
they'll even be in more trouble in front of the judge. Do you think this will encourage more people to challenge judges, or will it not make much of a difference?
I think it will encourage a continuation of what we've seen in Minnesota of good people applying to become a judge. So there are no opponents, so it does remove that. You don't have an attorney who says, boy, I could do a better job, but I have to campaign against that judge. And it's the old line, if you're going to take down the king, you better make sure you kill him. If I lose, what are the consequences for me and my clients when I go before that judge? In this process, now there's an objective evaluation that says, good judge, not such a good judge, and people make a decision without that kind of personal consequence.
Well, and if they lose the retention election, then it's like an open seat.
Then you go back to the merit selection panel.
Okay.
Right, so there's
And
not
you'd
a
have-
new election.
You would have other candidates who could be
Who-
appointed.
Correct, right,
Okay.
right. Now, you've got to make your case to this unbiased panel of experts. And then if you're the one nominated, you then ultimately will go through that same process of being evaluated and standing for election. So it keeps, all of the power still is retained by the public. But now it's meaningful power, because it's power that is informed. It's power that has objective facts behind it.
And this is a quick question, there have to be a popular vote. It's an amendment.
It's got to
or
be on the
proposal.
ballot.
It's got to be on the ballot.
Constitutional
Correct.
change.
Constitutional change. And the standard for that being approved is?
Is 50% plus 1
50%.
of all votes cast.
Right,
All votes cast, okay.
right.
So if you don't vote on this issue, it effectively becomes a no vote.
Right. Through the legislative process, it's a simple majority in both houses, and if the legislature passes it, it goes immediately onto the ballot. The governor cannot veto a constitutional amendment.
And the commission members are paid or volunteer?
I think that would be determined legislatively.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know.
That would not be part of the
Sort of
Constitution.
the follow-up comment here is quasi-government groups tend to become politically correct. What is to prevent that?
The public. Again, all of this is transparent. The people who are making the appointments are elected. The appointments are transparent. The work of the merit selection panel and of the evaluation panel ultimately becomes public. All of it is subject to disclosure.
People barely know who the legislators are. How are they gonna know these panel people?
But here's how I view it. And as I mentioned a while ago, I probably pay closer attention to all ballot contests than the average voter, because I've spent 6 years in the state legislature, 12 years in Congress. I just follow politics. Tom and I write a column once a month on political issues. So, and I can go into the voting booth and I see all these district judges on the ballot, and you'd think I would know who they all are. I don't. And it's not easy to track down information about these judges. As you say, we're trying to find out about the candidates for the state Senate, state House, Congress, That, at least, we've got ready information available to us. Here, if it's an uncontested race, there's essentially no information. If it's a contested race, you've maybe heard about it, but not maybe enough to know whether the challenger is blowing smoke or whether the challenger has a real issue. What I like about this approach is that it's going to be at least when you prep up for an election, you're going to that one page in the newspaper, you're at least going to have this page that tells you unqualified, qualified, or well qualified. And you know that that's going to be based on these types of criteria, and that information is also going to be accessible. So at least you then have that upon which to base a decision about a judge. If you want to supplement that with other considerations, you're welcome to it.
I think you
if can track
misunderstood
it
my
down.
question.
Yeah, on the commission members
Yeah.
themselves.
Oh, on the commission
Yeah,
members.
yeah, I don't think you will, no, I mean, I think it's a
Oh, I
fair
thought
point.
you
I
meant-
don't think you will know. I think you will, you certainly will know their work. That's what you have the opportunity to evaluate. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
as it stands right now, look, I think Minnesota has a great bench. Do I think, even with a great bench, that 90% of our justices, our judges, ought to continue serving? No. I mean, there probably it isn't 90% in any field that ought to continue. Now, I don't know what the percentage is, whether it's 15% or 12% or 50%, I don't know. Problem is that in all of these races, there's no way of knowing if that judge is good or bad, and there's no alternative. I'm saying I can vote for this person, but even if I don't, there's no consequence. The person still is going to be elected because there's no opponent. There's no alternative. The choice is, do we want to have an alternative that is dictated by partisan politics, where candidates for the bench have to go out and raise unseemly amounts of money, have to go before all of the screening groups that candidates for the executive and the legislative branches have to do, and put out all of their positions on issues before they have the facts of a specific case. Do we want that? Or do we want a process in which we have qualified people saying, here are the best candidates, pick one, Governor, and once that candidate becomes a judge and is on the bench, subject to qualified people saying, here's whether that judge is doing a good job or a bad job. Now I can go in with information, and my vote has consequence. My vote has meaning. If I vote no, don't retain this judge, there's a good chance that that judge is not going to continue on the bench. That gives me much more power than I have today when all of these races are running unopposed.
But states that have this, at least one that you mentioned, has 99% retention?
Oh, it's high, right. So, you know, the second part of this is, if we have the information, if we have a retention election, are we going to discharge our obligation as citizens? I can't answer that. What I can help do is encourage a process that I think is a better process than what almost certainly is coming down the road. How we use it is up to us.
Why shouldn't we use that in every area of public service?
Because I think in legislative races, in the executive branch, there is value in having clear partisan differences. I can say, as I did and ended up with 12% of the vote, I think we have an unsustainable tax system. We ought to tax clothing. And that's a public policy. And if you elect me, I'm going to promote that. And I think in an executive election, people have a right to know, and they ought to know what the positions are. In a court of law, I can say, here's the law, but it's not always black and white. There are nuances to it. I want to see the facts. I want to see how society is changing. I want to see how this case comes before me in this particular circumstance. And I shouldn't, as a candidate, say, whenever this issue comes before my court, I'm going to rule against it. I think there's an important difference that we ought to retain, and that we ought to celebrate, in fact.
So that therefore there are no absolutes in your world?
On the bench,
Yes.
no, I mean, I think you judge cases based on the facts.
But no absolutes.
I don't think forever and a day that there are absolutes, no. I mean, there may be, I can't think of one, and I'm not an attorney.
If I told you to quit breathing, what would be the consequences?
But that's not
Would
an
that be
issue of law,
absolute?
that's not an issue of law.
Fine.
Yeah, I think.
Sure, I mean, quit breathing, of course, that's an absolute. That's not an issue that a judge is going to decide on.
I think we've got about 10 minutes left for questions here, and one question, this might be for Common Cause, or maybe we can address it too. It says, you speak of impartiality, but why is only one side being presented here? Common Cause, want to take that one?
Do you guys want it first hand, or do you want me to take that one?
What was the question?
It was your question. The impartiality, why is only one side here?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
But the reason is there's not a lot of opposition to this.
Oh, come now.
Seriously, I know you'd love to say it's not, but I mean, this is a very,
Who
seems very
have you asked?
straightforward.
Who have you asked?
We haven't asked anyone.
Why?
Because
There you
we're
go.
putting this on.
No,
there's
you
no
say there
opposition.
isn't
Nobody
any,
knows.
but who have you asked?
But let me just say this, because I mean, I think that's a fair question and a good point. Absolutely. And so, you know, opening it up to questions, and every question that has come up here, we've tried to address candidly. But I'll say this, set up another forum, and if you want to join us in the panel, I'll be back here. I'd be happy to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I think it is an important conversation to have, and that we ought to have all sides reflected. I'd be more than happy to come to another forum if you want to set that up and have a back and forth. I'm happy to have that
So is
discussion.
Common Cause only willing to hear one side? Is that why Common Cause is only doing one side?
No, that is not true at all.
Well,
Well-
then, it's Common Cause is an organization that's set up to hold power
Yeah,
accountable.
yeah.
So why is it that there isn't more than
Look,
one?
I'm here because I support this issue, and I was asked to be on the panel, that's why I'm
Well,
here, okay?
it's not directed to you.
But, yeah, but my point is, would I be here if this were a debate? Sure, because I have an opinion, and I would be happy
You would,
to
yeah.
have someone on the other side debating me on this issue. But in defense of Common Cause, lots of organizations hold events to get the word out on an issue, and they don't always invite someone else to be on the panel at their event. You know, would that be better in some ways? Sure, but it's not unusual that whether it's the AFL-CIO or the chamber or the trial attorneys or the pro-life groups or the pro-choice groups, they hold an event to present their point of view.
And, you know, as some of your questions have pointed out, this isn't a perfect process. Nobody is claiming that this is going to solve any problem that anybody can foresee. It is a process that, in our opinion, is better than what is likely to come if we don't act now, if we don't take some preemptive action, if we don't make the decision that today in Minnesota, we have a very good judiciary. We ought to protect that. This is better than the alternative, in my opinion.
There were a couple other questions, most of them, what exactly will the amendment state? Do we have that on a website somewhere? or
No,
is it
the
not-
language.
Not formulated
Well,
yet?
the language would have to be worked out by the
Okay,
legislature.
okay.
And you remember there's the controversy that the Secretary of State has to actually put it on the ballot, and so that has to go through the legislative process.
Question here, how is seeing?
Oh, and in terms of who's sponsoring or who do we know that supports it, whoever asked that question, you got the answer back there. Yeah.
And there's also a website that has a lot of this
Yes.
information on it, www.impartialcourts.org.
Right.
That's up there, okay. There's also some information, how are we doing on time?
You probably have time for two more.
Two more questions. How is seeing how society is changing part of interpreting the law? It's kind of a,
Well, and that's what I thought you were getting to with the absolutes. I'm one who believes that our Constitution is a living document. I'm one who believes that we ought to be a reflection, government ought to be a reflection of society. And frankly, that's why I don't believe that judges ought to say with absolute certainty, whenever this issue comes before, I'll decide this way. I think there ought to be a recognition of where society is at within the spirit and letter of the law.
So would this panel or the commission be open to judge candidates that don't believe that the Constitution, state or federal or national, is a living document but is set law and needs to be followed?
My sense is that you'll have differing views on both the selection committee and the evaluation commission, because you're going to have both Democratic and Republican appointees to that commission, and there should be, I would expect, some appointees to that commission that view strict constructionists as the better way to adhere to the law. They may not be the majority. It depends on who's in the governor's office and who controls the legislature, but through our political process, this debate about how living, and some people would assert how liberal or how
right.
fluid should the Constitution be interpreted, and others that abide to a more strict interpretation of the letter of the Constitution. But I think that gets represented on through this process, because there ought to be both of those perspectives reflected here.
And ultimately, you're holding the governor accountable.
And the criteria that they're to measure them against is going to include impartiality, knowledge of the law, respect of the rule of law, which gets to that very issue. So the bottom line is as we've said throughout the evening, is this going to be a panacea? No. Does it present a better prospect that we will keep Minnesota courts largely impartial? Yeah, I think it does, because the other direction, which moves us in a more partisan partisan vein, I think is just something we don't want to bring into the courts.
That might speak to the last question here, and maybe Tom and Tim, you can give me a fairly concise answer. But most people believe that the current system of appointments can be partisan. It looks partisan sometimes. The Republican governor appointing judges we know are Republicans. Will the new system be any better at less partisanship than the current system? If I ask that correctly.
I don't know that I can promise that. What we can promise is that you would be bound by making a selection from the three nominees that are presented to you by the commission, and today you're not bound by that. But is it true that if you're a Republican governor, you may happen to know that one of those three has donated to the party at one time or another, or volunteered on a campaign at one time or another? And conversely, if you're a Democratic governor, might it be possible that one of the three names that comes forward is somebody you know from your Democratic past? It's possible.
Sure. Yeah, I would
but
agree.
Over time, I think it balances out.
Right.
So, again, not a panacea,
Okay.
but better than the alternative we fear we are facing.
Okay, we'll end with that. I thank you all for coming, and I thank the viewers online as well.
Thank you.
Good job, yeah. Just for that interesting.
Okay, no, I'm saying, other people want to.
Thing is at that website.
Yeah,
I got a lot of
impartialcourts.org.
Go there.
Because I wasn't sitting at this table, I got it. Is there appointments and election of judges?
You might want to, I'm trying to think,
It's constitutional, that's what, right, that's why this change, you need the constitution, yes, yes. And there is a merit
Yeah, a lot of
election
what I-
today, that's statute, so that was set up by law. And it only applies to the appellate court.
Some of what I was hearing, if they're kind of.
Now, some judges, some governors have used it for local appointments.
Well,
But the
just
statute.
vote for it, you can find out what it's all about later. You know, what kind of product you're gonna be running. It's gonna save everybody money, everybody's gonna have insurance coverage, and you get to keep your doctor, you get to keep your insurance if you like it, except none of that's true.
Yeah,
So at this point, we know that the camel
yes,
foot is torn in ten,
and,
but
what typically happens in any kind of merit election process is, you start to develop candidates that you vetted or qualified for, are good, and so you're not starting from scratch, going back to say, are you still interested, and isn't he good? Yeah. Joe makes it easy.
You know, since Secretary of State,
Right.
I think it's got. I think it's got some good components, and it's also got some components that really go off.
When you have time, it comes through a trusted source. It's easy to access, and it's a trusted source. That's a great point. Yes. Yeah. Well, and I'm sure it would, because it's information about a judge, and again, it's not favoring one candidate over another, because there's only one candidate.
And it's my understanding that somebody wants to choose to put their information on there that's
I
on
believe
the
that's
ballot.
right. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Hi.
Our founders could see 200 years ago.
But I think.
Right.
And they promise off,
And I'm not
these
sure
little
they will.
conversions promise off really good things.
You know, I think he's right that there's.
It might take 40 years to realize how much
Right. And I think, you know, certainly some of them are saying that's a good deal. Yeah, and I think that's a fair question.
Supreme Court, if you got it.
I'm not that good trying to think.
Well, unfortunately,
I guess that's true.
Well, I think they would deny it and take it over.
But
They back of certain.
Because he called it interested, but he would not know.
Process that now is determined by the.
If you're the head of the Supreme Court,
You can't stop the money. Right. And so that's coming. You gotta change the constitution and create a new process.
You can't make it tomorrow. Well, I said I told him. I told Diane.
Thanks, Joe, for I gotta stop that a lot.
And the power of the person. Give you a dime.